Welcome, dear listener, to Miss Marple, Death of the Vicar at Lantern Bridge, a cozy mystery in the timeless style of Agatha Christie. Join the sharp-witted Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzling death in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea for this tale of intrigue, hidden motives, and village secrets. Our story is divided into 10 chapters for your convenience. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow over Lantern Bridge. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the verdant folds of rural England, during the autumn of 1952, life unfolded with the gentle rhythm of a well-worn hymn. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, mingling with the faint sweetness of honeysuckle that clung to the ancient stone walls of the cottages. Thatched roofs, weathered by time and seasons, sloped low over diamond-paned windows, and the narrow lanes wound lazily past the village green, where children played and old men lingered on benches, exchanging tales as old as the hills. At the heart of this idyllic scene stood the church of St. Mary, its weathered spire piercing the pale October sky like a needle, stitching together the fabric of village life. Beside it, the vicarage sat, a sturdy Georgian house with ivy creeping up its walls, overlooking Lantern Bridge, a quaint stone arch spanning the babbling river Mead, where willows dipped their branches into the water's glassy surface. Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster with a delicate frame and eyes that sparkled with the sharpness of youth, sat in her cozy sitting room at the edge of the village. Her hands, though gnarled by age, moved with practiced ease, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as they wove a lacy shawl of soft gray wool. Her cottage, a modest affair with chintz curtains and a hearth that glowed with a low fire, offered a perfect vantage point over the village green. From her armchair by the window, she could observe the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants, her mind cataloging their habits with the precision of a botanist studying rare specimens. She often remarked to herself that human nature vicarage, slumped over his desk with a cup of tea gone stone cold beside him. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, her pale blue eyes lifting to meet Mrs. Price Ridley's. "Dead?" she said softly, her voice carrying a note of concern tempered by curiosity. "How very distressing. Was it his heart, do you think? He was no longer a young man." Mrs. Price Ridley shook her head so vigorously that her hat, a confection of feathers and velvet, threatened to topple. No, not his heart. Dr. Haydock was called at once, and he says it's likely poison. Arsenic, perhaps, in his evening cocoa. Can you imagine? Poison in St. Mary Mead. And the strangest thing of all, a note clutched in his hand, written in his own script. "The lantern's light reveals the truth." What on earth could it mean? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap as her mind began to turn over this new puzzle. Poison was not a word one heard often in St. Mary Mead, and the mention of a cryptic note piqued her interest. She had known Reverend Thomas Hargreaves, a kindly, if somewhat reserved man in his late 60s who had served the parish for nearly 2 decades. His sermons were thoughtful, if a touch long-winded, and his devotion to the annual Lantern Festival, a village tradition where paper lanterns were floated down the river in a glowing procession, was unmatched. The idea of someone wishing him harm seemed as out of place as a storm cloud on a summer's day. "Poison," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "And a note about lanterns. How very curious." She glanced out her window where the village green was coming to life with the morning's activity. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, was sweeping the steps of the post office, casting furtive glances toward the vicarage. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, pedaled past on his bicycle, his usual cheeky grin replaced by a somber expression. The news was spreading, as news always did in St. Mary Mead, like ripples across the river. Mrs. Price Ridley sank into a chair, with the vicar for years, but I've heard she's got a temper when crossed. And Miss Lydia Hargreaves, the vicar's niece, who came back from London not 3 months ago, all high and mighty with her paintbrushes and her artist's airs. Oh, and Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the vicar's sister, staying for the festival. She's a widow, you know, and they say she's set to inherit the vicarage estate. Quite a tidy sum, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sorting through this cast of characters. She had met them all at various village functions, the harvest supper, the church fete, the lantern festival committee meetings, Timothy Ellis with his earnest sermons and habit of blushing when addressed directly, Mrs. Bonner, whose scones were the pride of the tea-room, but whose sharp tongue could cut like a knife, Lydia Hargreaves, a striking young woman with a guarded air, as if she carried secrets she wasn't ready to share, and Mrs. Finch, elegant and composed, but with a certain coolness that Miss Marple had noted during their brief conversations. "Anyone else?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "Well, Colonel Prothero was seen arguing with the vicar last week, something about church funds. Called him a sanctimonious fool right in the village hall. And Dr. Haydock, bless him, had his differences with the vicar over those temperance lectures. The Reverend didn't approve of the doctor's fondness for a nip of brandy now and then." Miss Marple's lips twitched, though whether in amusement or disapproval it was hard to say. "And the note," she said. "You're certain it said, 'The lantern's light reveals the truth'?" "Word for word," Mrs. Price Ridley declared. "Mrs. Bonner showed it to me before the police arrived, written on a scrap of the vicar's sermon paper in his own hand. It's also mysterious." The word mysterious hung in the air, as fitting for St. Mary Mead as it was unsettling. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and moved to the window, her gaze drifting toward Lantern Bridge. The little stone structure with its moss-covered arches was a village landmark, named for the lanterns that glowed there each autumn during the festival. Single feather, and stepped out into the autumn chill. The village was abuzz, neighbors clustering in small knots, their voices hushed but urgent. She passed the tea-room, where Miss Hartnell was holding court, and the blacksmith's, where old Mr. Clegg shook his head mournfully. By the time she reached Lantern Bridge, the mist had lifted, revealing the vicarage in all its somber dignity. The front door stood ajar, and Inspector Slack's voice boomed from within, questioning someone, likely Mrs. Bonner, judging by the indignant replies. Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, her eyes scanning the scene. The vicarage lawn was neatly trimmed, the flower beds bursting with late chrysanthemums. A single paper lantern, left over from last year's festival, dangled from a low branch, its faded colors swaying in the breeze. And there, by the bridge, a glint caught her eye, a shard of glass, half hidden in the grass, reflecting the weak sunlight. She stooped, her joints protesting, and retrieved it carefully. A fragment of a vial, perhaps, or a broken bottle. Nothing remarkable in itself, yet Miss Marple tucked it into her pocket. In her experience, the smallest details often held the greatest truths. As she straightened, she saw young Tommy Pierce watching her from across the bridge, his bicycle propped against a tree. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, his voice subdued. "Awful business, isn't it?" "Very awful," she agreed, her tone gentle but her mind already racing. The vicar's death, the poison, the note, the vial. Pieces of a puzzle that St. Mary Mead, with its deceptively quiet ways, had laid at her feet. And Miss Jane Marple, with her knack for seeing what others overlooked, was determined to fit them together. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, burning away the last wisps of morning mist that clung to the willows along the river Mead. By noon, the village was alive with the quiet hum of daily life, though an undercurrent of unease rippled through the cobblestone lanes. The news of Reverend's senses were as alert as a cat's. She was no stranger to the vicarage, having attended many a committee meeting for the Lantern Festival or shared tea with the late Reverend. Today, however, her visit was prompted by more than neighborly duty. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the vicar's widowed sister, greeted her in the drawing room, her elegant frame draped in a black shawl that seemed more a nod to propriety than genuine grief. Her face, though composed, bore the faint strain of sleeplessness, and her hands twisted a lace handkerchief as she offered Miss Marple a seat. "It's good of you to come, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and measured. "This has been a terrible shock." "My dear Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chintz-covered chair, "I can only imagine your distress. Poor Reverend Hargreaves was so much a part of St. Mary Mead. To lose him so suddenly, and in such a manner." Mrs. Finch's lips tightened. "The police are calling it poison. Arsenic, they think, in his cocoa last night. It's unthinkable. Thomas was a good man, perhaps too trusting." Her eyes flicked toward the door where voices echoed from the hall. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the arrival of the vicarage's other occupants. Mr. Timothy Ellis, the young curate, entered first, his thin frame almost swallowed by his black clerical garb. His hands fidgeted with his collar, a nervous habit Miss Marple had observed during his halting sermons. Behind him came Mrs. Edith Bonner, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a face like a weathered apple, her apron immaculate despite the morning's chaos. Last was Miss Lydia Hargreaves, the vicar's niece, her auburn hair pulled back severely, her artist's hands stained faintly with paint. Her eyes, a striking green, avoided contact with the others, lingering instead on the window overlooking Lantern Bridge. Inspector Slack, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, joined them, his notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said with a curt nod, clearly unimpressed by her presence. In his study, working on his sermon. He seemed preoccupied, but not unwell. "Preoccupied," Slack pressed, scribbling in his notebook. "How so?" "He was muttering about betrayal," Ellis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about a trusted hand. I thought he meant a parishioner, perhaps someone who'd disappointed him." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Betrayal, a word that carried weight in a village where trust was the currency of daily life. She glanced at Lydia, whose fingers were twisting a loose thread on her skirt. "And you, Miss Hargreaves?" Slack turned to the niece. "Where were you?" Lydia's chin lifted, though her voice trembled slightly. "I was in my room, painting. I didn't see Uncle Thomas after dinner. He was excited about the Lantern Festival, said it would be the best yet. I can't believe anyone would—" She trailed off, her eyes glistening. Mrs. Finch interjected, her tone cool. "My brother was healthy as a horse. If there was poison, it wasn't an accident. Someone in this house or this village had a reason. The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way Ellis's hands stilled, his knuckles whitening. Mrs. Bonner returned with a tea tray, her movements brisk but her eyes darting suspiciously. "I made that cocoa myself," she declared, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Same as every night. If there's poison, it wasn't from my kitchen." Miss Marple accepted a cup, her gaze lingering on the housekeeper's apron. A faint brown stain, barely noticeable, marred the hem. Cocoa, perhaps, or something more sinister. She sipped her tea, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. The note, "The lantern's light reveals the truth," suggested a deliberate act, a message meant to be found. But by whom? And why? As the inspector continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village beyond the vicarage. St. Mary Mead was had Mrs. Finch's gloves, neatly folded on the side table, carried a faint whiff of cocoa when she entered? Or was it Miss Marple's imagination, primed by the talk of poison? Lydia's alibi was vaguer. "I was in my room, as I said. I often paint late into the night. The light by the bridge is lovely at dusk." Her voice was soft, but there was a brittleness to it, as if she were guarding something. Ellis, too, was evasive. "After the vestry, I took a walk. I needed air. The festival preparations have been overwhelming." Inspector Slack grunted, clearly frustrated by the lack of concrete answers. "And you, Mrs. Bonner? You made the cocoa. Did anyone else have access to it?" Mrs. Bonner bristled. "The kitchen is my domain, Inspector. I left the cocoa on the tray outside his study at 8:30, as always. If someone tampered with it, they did it after I left." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging these details. The cocoa, the note, the alibis. Each a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She glanced at Lydia, who was staring at Ellis with an intensity that spoke of more than casual acquaintance. A lover's quarrel, perhaps? Or something deeper, tied to the vicar's estate? As the inspector excused himself to examine the study, Miss Marple rose, thanking Mrs. Finch for the tea. "I mustn't keep you," she said, her voice warm but her eyes keen. "But if I might have a word with Mrs. Bonner about the festival committee, I'd be most grateful." In the kitchen, Mrs. Bonner was scrubbing a pot with unnecessary vigor. "Terrible business," she muttered. The vicar was a good man, even if he was particular about his cocoa. "Particular?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of polite curiosity. "Oh, I liked it just so. 2 spoons of cocoa, 1 of sugar, not too hot. I made it the same every night for years." Her hands paused and she looked at Miss Marple sharply. "You don't think I had anything to do with it, do you?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said soothingly. "That the truth, like the lanterns that would soon light the river, was waiting to be revealed." Chapter 3. Whispers in the Tea Room. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the thatched cottages and gilding the cobblestone paths. The village, though outwardly serene, thrummed with the quiet agitation that follows a tragedy. By 1 o'clock, the tea room on the village green had become the epicenter of speculation, its lace-curtained windows framing a tableau of animated faces. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, made her way there, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the path. The shard of glass from Lantern Bridge and the missing festival lantern mentioned by Mrs. Bonner lingered in her thoughts, small pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. The vicar's death, with its whispered talk of poison and a cryptic note, had stirred the village like a stone dropped into the still waters of the River Mead. The tea room, run by the ever-cheerful Miss Emily Hartnell, was a cozy haven of chintz tablecloths and mismatched china. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked scones and strong Darjeeling, and the low hum of conversation paused briefly as Miss Marple entered. She nodded politely to the gathered ladies, Miss Hartnell, bustling behind the counter, Mrs. Weatherby, the prim postmistress with a penchant for order, and Mrs. Price Ridley, still flushed from her morning's gossip. A few other villagers, including young Anne Prothero, the colonel's daughter, sat at a corner table, her delicate features clouded with unease. "Miss Marple, do join us," Miss Hartnell called, waving a flour-dusted hand. "Such a dreadful day, isn't it?" "Poor Reverend Hargreaves. We were just saying how shocking it all is." Miss Marple settled at their table, accepting a cup of tea and a scone with a murmur of thanks. "Indeed," she said, her voice gentle, but her eyes keen as they scanned the room. "A tragedy for St. Mary Mead. Have you heard anything new?" "Think, Miss Prothero," Miss Marple asked kindly. "You knew the vicar well, I imagine, with your father so active in church affairs." Anne started, her cheeks flushing. "Oh yes, father was involved. He and the vicar didn't always see eye to eye, but I can't believe anyone would hurt him. Reverend Hargreaves was so kind, always encouraging my music lessons." Her voice wavered, and she looked away toward the window. Miss Marple noted the girl's discomfort, recalling the village rumor that Anne had once fancied Timothy Ellis, the curate, only to be rebuffed. Young love, she knew, could breed resentment as easily as affection. She made a mental note to observe Ellis more closely. The conversation turned to suspects, as it inevitably did in St. Mary Mead. Miss Hartnell, wiping her hands on her apron, offered her opinion with relish. "I wouldn't put it past that Mrs. Finch, you know. She's been staying at the vicarage, acting all high and mighty. They say she's to inherit everything, the vicarage, the savings, the lot. Greed does strange things to people." Mrs. Weatherby shook her head. "Eleanor Finch is a lady, Emily. I'd look to that housekeeper, Mrs. Bonner, always muttering about her wages, and she was the one who made the cocoa. If anyone had the chance to slip something in, it was her." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging these tidbits. Mrs. Finch's inheritance was a plausible motive, though her cool demeanor suggested calculation rather than passion. Mrs. Bonner, on the other hand, had the opportunity, but lacked an obvious reason, unless her sharp tongue hid a deeper grievance. The tea room buzzed with theories, each villager adding their own flourish to the tale. "What about Colonel Prothero?" Mrs. Price Ridley said, lowering her voice. "He was furious with the vicar last week, shouting about church funds in the village hall. Called him a sanctimonious fool right in front of everyone. And he's got a temper, that one." Anne's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "That's not fair." "Could be full of all sorts of things." Miss Marple's lips twitched, though she hid her amusement behind her teacup. Dr. Haydock was a respected figure, but his occasional tipple was no secret. Still, his medical knowledge made him a candidate worth considering. She glanced around the tea room, noting a small lantern ornament on the mantel, a delicate paper creation, similar to those used in the festival. It was slightly askew, as if someone had bumped it. "How curious," she murmured, filing the observation away. As the ladies continued their speculation, Miss Marple's attention drifted to Anne Prothero, who had grown quiet again. The girl's hands were clasped tightly, and her gaze kept straying to the door, as if expecting someone. Miss Marple followed her line of sight and saw Timothy Ellis passing by outside, his head bowed as he hurried toward the church. Anne's expression softened, then hardened, a flicker of emotion that spoke volumes. "Miss Prothero," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to share?" Anne hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing. Just, the vicar was kind to me, that's all. I can't believe he's gone." Her voice cracked, and she excused herself, slipping out of the tea room with a murmured apology. Mrs. Price Ridley raised an eyebrow. "That girl's hiding something, mark my words. I heard she was sweet on Mr. Ellis, but he's got eyes for Lydia Hargreaves now. Quite the scandal, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. A love triangle, however cliché, could complicate matters. Jealousy was a powerful motive, and Anne's agitation suggested more than simple grief. She made a mental note to speak with Ellis later, perhaps at the church, where he'd be preparing for the memorial service. The tea-room conversation turned to the Lantern Festival, now overshadowed by the vicar's death. "It's this Saturday," Miss Hartnell said, shaking her head. "I don't know how we'll manage without the vicar. He was the heart of it, choosing the lanterns, organizing the procession. And now this talk of a missing lantern. Mrs. Bonner was complaining." Green was quieter now, with children playing near the duck pond and old Mr. Clegg sweeping leaves from his doorstep. She paused by the churchyard, where the vicar's grave would soon be dug, and noticed a figure lingering near the gate. Lydia Hargreaves, her sketchbook under her arm, her eyes fixed on Lantern Bridge. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Miss Hargreaves, I didn't expect to see you here. Sketching, are you?" Lydia started, clutching her sketchbook. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, I find the bridge inspiring. The way the light falls on the water." Her voice was soft, but there was a tremor in it, as if she were holding back tears or secrets. "It's a lovely spot," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes noting the faint smudge of paint on Lydia's sleeve. "You must be terribly shaken by your uncle's death." Lydia nodded, her gaze distant. "He was kind to me, letting me stay at the vicarage. I don't know what I'll do now." Miss Marple's tone was sympathetic, but her mind was sharp. "I'm sure you'll find your way. The village has a way of coming together in times like these." As Lydia murmured a farewell and hurried off, Miss Marple lingered by the churchyard, her eyes drawn to the bridge. The river flowed steadily beneath it, its surface catching the fading light. Somewhere in this village, she knew, lay the truth about the vicar's death, a truth as elusive as the lanterns that would soon float down the river, glowing with secrets of their own. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The late afternoon light draped St. Mary Mead in a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across the village green and turning the River Mead into a ribbon of gold. The air held the sharp bite of autumn, mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the faint smoke from chimneys beginning to stir. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked slowly along the lane toward the churchyard, her mind turning over the threads of the mystery that had unsettled the village. The vicar's death, poisoned, they said, by arsenic in his evening cocoa, lessened. with only a single constable lingering near the front door. But the air still hummed with questions. As she approached the bridge, Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught a flicker of movement in the churchyard. It was Lydia Hargreaves, the vicar's niece, standing near a row of gravestones, her sketchbook open but her pencil idle. Her auburn hair gleamed in the fading light, and her expression was one of quiet intensity, as if she were searching for something beyond the stones. Miss Marple's approach was silent, her steps softened by the grass, but Lydia started when she spoke. "Good afternoon, Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but laced with purpose. "I see you're sketching again. The churchyard is quite peaceful, isn't it?" Lydia closed her sketchbook with a snap, her green eyes wary. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, it's calming. I needed to get away from the vicarage. All those questions from Inspector Slack, it's overwhelming." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "It must be difficult, losing your uncle so suddenly. Were you very close?" Lydia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "Uncle Thomas was kind to me. He let me stay at the vicarage when I came back from London. But we didn't talk much. He was always busy with the church, the festival." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced toward the bridge, where the river murmured softly. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the way Lydia's eyes lingered on the water. "The lantern festival was dear to him, wasn't it? I hear a lantern went missing from the supplies. Such a pity." Lydia's head snapped up, a flicker of alarm crossing her face. "Yes, Mrs. Bonner mentioned it. I don't know anything about it, though. I've been too busy painting." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Art can be such a comfort in troubled times." She paused, then added casually, "I saw you speaking with Mr. Ellis earlier, near the church. You seem to know him well." Lydia's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "He's the curate. We've worked together on festival plans, that's all." Her word Lydia hissed, her tone sharp with frustration. "Now everything's ruined. The police are poking into everything, and I can't—" "Keep your voice down," Ellis snapped, his usual nervous demeanor replaced by urgency. "I did what I could. It's not my fault he found out." Miss Marple's needles tucked in her bag seemed to itch for action, though she remained still. Inheritance. Found out. The words were like puzzle pieces, jagged but promising. Had the vicar discovered something about Lydia or Ellis? Perhaps a scheme tied to his estate. She filed the conversation away, knowing it would need revisiting. As the pair moved off, Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place and continued toward the village green. The tea-room conversation had planted seeds of suspicion, and now the soil was fertile with motives. Colonel Lucius Prothero, with his public quarrel over church funds, was an obvious suspect, his temper as notorious as his military medals. Dr. Haydock's rivalry over temperance lectures, though seemingly trivial, could mask a deeper grudge, especially given his access to poisons. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the vicar's sister, stood to inherit the vicarage estate. A tidy sum, as Mrs. Price Ridley had put it. Mrs. Bonner, the housekeeper, had the opportunity, having prepared the fatal cocoa. And then there was Anne Prothero, whose unrequited feelings for Ellis might have stirred darker emotions. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the sight of Inspector Slack striding across the green, his face set in a scowl. He was followed by a young constable, who looked harried as he carried a notebook and a small evidence bag. Miss Marple slowed her pace, allowing them to pass, and caught a snippet of their conversation. "Vagrant seen near the vicarage last night," Slack was saying. "Old Clegg swears he saw a stranger by the bridge, scruffy-looking, carrying a sack. Could have slipped in and tampered with the cocoa. The constable nodded eagerly. "Shall we bring him in, sir?" "Find him first," Slack growled. "And check that shed again. That arsenic bottle didn't walk off on its own." Miss Marple, delicate frames catching the light. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The air smelled of damp wood and linseed oil, and a rusty rake leaned precariously against a shelf. There, on a dusty ledge, was an empty space where a bottle might have stood, presumably the arsenic mentioned by Slack. She bent closer, her joints protesting, and noticed a faint smudge on the shelf's edge. Not dust, but a powdery residue, white and fine. Arsenic? Or something more mundane, like chalk from the festival lanterns? She made a mental note to ask Dr. Haydock about common poisons, under the guise of discussing her rheumatism. As she straightened, she heard footsteps, and turned to see Colonel Prothero approaching, his military stride unmistakable. His face, weathered by years in India, was set in a scowl, and his left hand, always trembling from an old war wound, clutched a walking stick. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, tipping his hat. "Snooping about, are you?" "Merely admiring the festival preparations," she replied, her smile serene. "The lanterns are lovely this year." The colonel snorted. "Hargreaves was obsessed with those blasted lanterns. Accused me of mismanaging the funds for them, as if I'd stoop to such a thing. Sanctimonious fool." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A disagreement, I take it." "A misunderstanding," he corrected, though his tone was defensive. I told him the accounts were in order, but he wouldn't listen. Kept muttering about betrayal, as if I'd betray the church I've served for decades. There was that word again. Betrayal. Miss Marple's mind flashed to Ellis's overheard conversation with Lydia. "It must have been trying," she said sympathetically. "Did you see him last night, by chance?" The colonel's eyes narrowed. "I was at home, playing bridge with my wife and Dr. Haydock, them into a pattern that revealed the truth." Chapter 5. The festival approaches. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in hues of apricot and lavender as Friday's twilight settled over the village. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint tang of the river Mead, where preparations for the annual Lantern Festival were in full swing. Lanterns of delicate paper, some hand-painted with intricate designs, were being strung along the banks, their soft glow promising a spectacle come Saturday evening. Yet, beneath the festive bustle, the shadow of Reverend Hargreaves' death loomed, the word poison whispered in every corner of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag in hand, walked the familiar path from her cottage to the village hall, her mind weaving together the clues that had surfaced. The glass shard by Lantern Bridge, the missing festival lantern, the powdery residue in the vicarage shed, and the overheard argument between Lydia Hargreaves and Timothy Ellis about inheritance and betrayal. The village hall, a sturdy brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, was abuzz with activity. Volunteers bustled about, arranging tables for the festival's refreshment stall, while others tested lanterns by the riverbank. Miss Marple paused at the hall's entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. The Lantern Festival was the heart of St. Mary Mead's autumn, a tradition where villagers floated glowing orbs down the river in memory of loved ones. Reverend Hargreaves had been its champion, and his absence left a void as tangible as the chill in the air. Inside, Miss Marple found Mrs. Edith Bonner, the vicarage housekeeper, directing a group of volunteers with her usual brisk efficiency. Her stout frame was clad in a starched apron, and her face bore the strain of the past 2 days, though her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Mind the lanterns now," she called to a young boy struggling with a stack of paper frames. "They're delicate, not like your football." Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "Mrs. Bonner, you're doing wonders," slung over his shoulder, and his face flushed from the cold. Or perhaps something stronger. He greeted the volunteers with a hearty wave, but his smile faltered when he caught sight of Mrs. Bonner. "Edith, still terrorizing the troops?" he said, his tone jovial but strained. Mrs. Bonner's eyes narrowed. "Someone's got to keep things in order, Doctor. Unlike some who think a nip of brandy solves everything." The jab was pointed, and Miss Marple noted the way Dr. Haydock's hand tightened on his bag. The village gossip about his rivalry with the vicar over temperance lectures was well known, and Mrs. Bonner's barb suggested deeper tensions. Now, Miss Marple said soothingly. "We're all a bit on edge. Dr. Haydock, I was meaning to ask, how is Mrs. Clegg's rheumatism? I saw her yesterday looking poorly." Dr. Haydock seized the change of topic, though his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his scarf. "She's improving, thank you. A touch of liniment and rest does wonders, though I've been run off my feet with this business at the vicarage." He lowered his voice. "Arsenic, they say. Nasty stuff. I told Slack it's not something you'd find lying about unless someone meant to use it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Indeed. You'd know better than most, being a doctor. Is arsenic common in medical practice these days?" "Not as much as it once was," he replied a touch too quickly. "Used for rat poison mostly. But it's not hard to come by if you know where to look." He excused himself, hurrying to help with the lanterns. But Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool air. The hall filled with more villagers, including Colonel Lucius Prothero, whose military bearing cut through the crowd like a ship through water. His daughter Anne trailed behind, her delicate features pale and her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple observed them closely, recalling the Colonel's public spat with the vicar and Anne's rumored feelings for Timothy Ellis. The Colonel was barking orders about the lantern procession, his left hand trembling as always. Couldn't hear their words, but the tension between them was palpable, echoing the argument she'd overheard in the churchyard. As the meeting progressed, the volunteers discussed logistics, lantern placements, the procession route, the timing of the river float. Miss Marple listened attentively, her needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The festival was a perfect cover for someone with a guilty conscience, she mused. Crowds, distractions, and the cover of darkness could hide all manner of sins. The missing lantern in particular gnawed at her. Was it merely misplaced, or had it played a role in the vicar's death? Her musings were interrupted by a commotion at the door. Inspector Slack strode in, his face thunderous, followed by his young constable, who carried a sack that looked suspiciously like evidence. "Mrs. Bonner," Slack called, his voice cutting through the chatter. "A word, if you please." Mrs. Bonner bristled, wiping her hands on her apron. "What now, Inspector? I've told you everything I know about that Coco." Slack held up the sack, revealing a tattered coat and a pair of worn boots. "Found these near the bridge, hidden in the bushes. Belonged to that vagrant old Clegg reported seeing last night. You said you saw no strangers at the vicarage, but I'm wondering if you're covering for someone." The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Bonner. Her face reddened, but her voice was steady. "I told you, Inspector. I saw no one. If there was a vagrant, he didn't come through my kitchen." Miss Marple's needles paused. The vagrant was a convenient distraction, but she doubted he was the key. In her experience, crimes in villages like St. Mary Mead were rarely the work of outsiders. She glanced at Colonel Prothero, who was watching the exchange with a scowl, and Dr. Haydock, who had busied himself with a lantern but was clearly listening. Anne Prothero's hands were trembling, and Lydia Hargreaves had slipped to the back of the room, her face pale. As Slack continued questioning Mrs. Bonner, Miss Marple approached Timothy Ellis, who was sorting lantern wicks with a small detail on the refreshment table. A discarded festival program, its corners smudged with what looked like ink, or perhaps paint. She tucked it into her bag, recalling Lydia's paint-stained sleeve. The vicar's diary, mentioned in passing by Mrs. Finch, had referenced a meeting with L.P., Lucius Prothero, or perhaps Lydia herself. The initials were another thread, delicate but promising. As the meeting wound down, Miss Marple stepped outside, the evening air cool against her cheeks. The river sparkled under the first stars, and the lanterns along the bank glowed softly, a promise of tomorrow's beauty. Yet the festival's approach felt like a countdown, each glowing orb a reminder of the vicar's cryptic note. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the glass shard, the missing lantern, and the powdery residue in the shed. She sensed the truth was close, hidden in the everyday rhythms of St. Mary Mead, waiting for the lantern's light to reveal it. Chapter 6. Misdirection in the Mist. A thick fog rolled in over St. Mary Mead on Saturday morning, shrouding the village in a ghostly veil that muffled sounds and softened the outlines of cottages and trees. The River Mead, usually a sparkling ribbon, was barely visible beneath the mist, its banks lined with the faint glow of lanterns prepared for the evening's festival. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant tang of wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the chill, stepped out of her cottage, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The fog seemed a fitting metaphor for the mystery surrounding Reverend Hargreaves' death, a puzzle clouded by misdirection, with clues like the glass shard, the missing lantern, and the cryptic note. The lantern's light reveals the truth, obscured in the haze of village secrets. The vicar's poisoning, confirmed by Dr. Haydock as arsenic in his cocoa, had set St. Mary Mead abuzz with suspicion. Miss Marple's mind turned over the threads she'd gathered. The powdery residue in the vicarage shed, the overheard argument between Lydia Hargreaves and Timothy Ellis about inheritance, the smudged festival as he fumbled with a stack of hymnals for the evening service. His nervous energy was palpable, and Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice warm. "You've taken on quite a task, managing the festival without the vicar. He would be proud." Ellis started, nearly dropping the hymnals. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, it's a lot. I'm trying to keep things as he would have wanted." His eyes darted toward the vicarage, where a police constable stood guard. "The police are still poking about. It's unsettling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her needles appearing as she settled onto a bench. Inspector Slack seems convinced a vagrant is to blame. What do you think? Ellis's fingers twitched at his collar. A vagrant? I suppose it's possible. I didn't see anyone that night, but... Well, the vicarage is so open, anyone could have slipped in. His voice lacked conviction, and he glanced toward the bridge, where Lydia Hargreaves was arranging lanterns with Anne Prothero. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the tension between the two women. Lydia's movements were precise, almost mechanical, while Anne's hands trembled as she tied a lantern to a post. The tea-room gossip about Anne's feelings for Ellis and his apparent interest in Lydia came to mind, and Miss Marple wondered if jealousy might have played a role in the vicar's death. She made a mental note to speak with Anne later, perhaps under the guise of admiring her music. As Ellis excused himself to help with the lanterns, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a commotion near the vicarage. Inspector Slack emerged, his face red with frustration, holding a small evidence bag. He was berating his constable, who looked suitably chastened. "You call this thorough?" Slack snapped. These letters were under the vicar's desk, plain as day, forged by the look of them, implicating Colonel Prothero in some shady deal with the church funds. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Forged letters were a classic misdirection, designed to throw suspicion onto an easy target. She recalled the colonel's bluster about his argument with the vicar. Looking for a culprit? Almost as if someone wanted you to find them. Slack's scowl deepened, but he didn't respond, storming off toward the village green. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over the possibility of a setup. The colonel was a convenient scapegoat, but his temper made him an unlikely poisoner. Poison required patience, not passion. She filed the letters away as another red herring, like the vagrant and the missing arsenic bottle. Her thoughts were interrupted by Anne Prothero, who approached the bridge, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something. It's about Timothy." Miss Marple patted the bench beside her. "Sit, my dear. You look quite distressed. Whatever it is, I'm sure it's better out than in." Anne hesitated, then sank onto the bench, her hands twisting in her lap. "I lied to the police. I said I was home all evening, but I wasn't. I was at the vicarage late after dinner. I went to see Timothy, to talk about us. I thought he cared for me, but he's been so distant. Always with Lydia." Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes. "I saw the vicar in his study through the window. He was alive, writing something. I didn't go in, I swear, but what if someone saw me and thinks I did it?" Miss Marple's expression was one of gentle concern, but her mind was racing. Anne's confession was a complication, though not necessarily a truthful one. The girl's agitation suggested guilt, but whether for a crime or a broken heart, it was hard to say. "Did you see anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. "Perhaps near the bridge or the vicarage?" Anne shook her head. "It was dark and the fog was coming in. I heard footsteps, though, near the river. I thought it was Timothy, but he was still in the vestry when I left." Footsteps in the fog. Miss Marple filed this away, recalling the indentation she'd noticed by the riverbank. "You've done well to tell me, Anne," she said. "But you must tell Inspector Slack, too." Noting the faint smell of cocoa lingering in the air. "Have the police found anything new?" Mrs. Finch's lips tightened. "They're obsessed with that vagrant and now some letters about Colonel Prothero. It's all nonsense. Thomas was killed by someone he knew, I'm certain of it. He mentioned betrayal, in his diary. A trusted hand. Miss Marple's needles paused. The diary again, with its mention of LP and betrayal. How distressing, she said. Did he say anything else about this betrayal? Mrs. Finch shook her head. Not to me. But he was troubled the last few days, always locking himself in his study. I thought it was the festival, but now... She trailed off, her eyes distant. Miss Marple rose, her gaze falling on the cocoa tin on a side table, left untouched since the police had examined it. She approached it casually, as if admiring the room's decor, and noticed a faint smudge on its lid. Not a fingerprint, but a smear of something waxy, like candle wax or lantern wick residue. Mrs. Bonner keeps a tidy house, she remarked. But this tin seems out of place. Mrs. Finch glanced at it, her expression unreadable. Edith's been distracted. We all have. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The wax suggested a connection to the lanterns, perhaps the missing one. She thanked Mrs. Finch and stepped outside, the fog thicker now, cloaking the village in secrecy. As she crossed Lantern Bridge, she paused, her eyes drawn to the riverbank. In the dim light, she spotted another clue, a scrap of paper caught in the reeds, its edge smudged with paint. She retrieved it carefully, noting its resemblance to Lydia's sketchbook paper. The fog seemed to close in as Miss Marple headed home, the lanterns along the river glowing like will-o'-the-wisps. The misdirection was clear, vagrants, forged letters, tearful confessions. But the truth, she sensed, lay in the everyday details. A smudged tin, a missing stitches of her shawl taking shape. The vicar's note, "The lantern's light reveals the truth," felt closer to revelation, and Miss Marple sensed the truth was near, hidden in the village's everyday rhythms. The festival preparations were in full swing, with villagers bustling about, their voices mingling with the murmur of the river. Miss Marple made her way to the village green, where a crowd had gathered for the opening ceremony. Children clutched lanterns, their faces alight with excitement, while adults exchanged hushed whispers about the vicar's poisoning. The air was rich with the scent of mulled cider and freshly baked pies from the refreshment stall. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the key figures in the mystery, all present under the guise of celebration. Colonel Lucius Prothero stood near the refreshment table, his military bearing unmistakable as he lit a lantern with his trembling left hand. His daughter Anne hovered nearby, her eyes darting nervously toward Timothy Ellis, who was adjusting lanterns along the bridge. Lydia Hargreaves stood apart, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her gaze fixed on the river. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, elegant in her black shawl, was speaking with Mrs. Edith Bonner, whose apron was as starched as ever despite the day's chaos. Dr. Haydock, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, was handing out lanterns to children, his hearty laugh a touch too forced. Miss Marple settled onto a bench, her needles clicking as she observed the scene. The festival was a perfect setting for secrets to surface, or be concealed. The missing lantern mentioned by Mrs. Bonner gnawed at her. She recalled the waxy smudge on the cocoa tin, which suggested a connection to the lanterns. Perhaps their wicks. The scrap of paper from the riverbank, with its paint smudge, pointed to Lydia. But was it too obvious? Miss Marple's mind turned to the vicar's diary, with its mention of L.P. and betrayal. Lucius Prothero was the obvious candidate, but Lydia's initials dragged my name through the mud with those forged letters. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. Forged letters are a nasty business. They suggest someone wanted to point the finger at you. Did the vicar ever mention anything about the church funds, beyond your disagreement? The colonel's face reddened. He kept harping on about discrepancies, as if I'd skim a penny. I've served this village for decades. My honor's not in question. His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby villagers, and he lowered it with effort. He mentioned something about a trusted hand betraying him, but I thought he meant that fidgety curate. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. The phrase trusted hand echoed the vicar's diary and Ellis's overheard conversation with Lydia. She thanked the colonel and moved toward the bridge, where Timothy Ellis was lighting lanterns with a trembling hand. His nervous demeanor was more pronounced tonight, and Miss Marple wondered if the festival's pressure or his own secrets were weighing on him. "Mr. Ellis," she said, approaching, "you've done wonders with the lanterns. They're quite beautiful." Ellis started, nearly dropping his match. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you. It's what the vicar would have wanted." His eyes darted toward Lydia, who was now helping Anne Prothero with a lantern, their heads bent close in tense conversation. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the strain between the two women. "You and Miss Hargreaves have been working closely, I see. It must be a comfort to have her support." Ellis's cheeks flushed, and he fumbled with his collar. "She's helpful. The festival takes many hands." His voice was strained, and he excused himself, hurrying to the riverbank. Miss Marple's mind turned to Anne's confession about visiting the vicarage and the footsteps she'd heard in the fog. The festival's chaos would have provided cover for someone to slip into the vicarage. But who? She decided to revisit the vicarage study, where the cocoa tin and the vicar's note had been found. Under the pretense of delivering a festival program to Mrs. Finch, she made her way to the vicarage, the fog now a faint haze under the lantern light. Mrs. Finch received her in the drawing room. "Betrayal, you know. I think it was someone close to him, someone he trusted." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Did he keep his diary in the study? Perhaps there's more to find." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then nodded. "He was always writing in it. The police took it, but they missed something. A loose page, tucked in his sermon notes. I found it this morning." She retrieved a folded sheet from a drawer and handed it to Miss Marple. The page was in the vicar's neat script, but the ink was faint, almost invisible in parts. Miss Marple held it up to the lantern light streaming through the window, and words emerged. "The bridge's shadow hides the sin." Her heart quickened. The note echoed the one found in the vicar's hand, but this was more specific, pointing to the bridge itself. Was it a clue to the poison's source, or another misdirection? "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said, tucking the page into her bag. "This could be important. Might I see the study, just to pay my respects?" Mrs. Finch agreed, leading her to the study, where the air was heavy with the scent of old books and wax polish. The desk, still cordoned off by police tape, bore the marks of their search. Papers scattered, a cold teacup untouched. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the windowsill, where a faint smudge of wax matched the cocoa tins. She bent closer, noticing a tiny splinter of glass embedded in the wood, similar to the shard from the bridge. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The glass, the wax, the missing lantern, all pointed to the festival. But how? She thanked Mrs. Finch and stepped outside, where the lanterns were now glowing brightly along the river. The crowd had gathered for the procession, and Miss Marple joined them, her eyes scanning the suspects. Colonel Prothero was lighting a lantern, his trembling hand betraying nerves rather than injury. Dr. Haydock was joking with villagers, but his eyes were watchful. Lydia and Anne stood apart, their tension palpable, while Ellis hovered near the bridge, his face pale. Glow was revealing more than beauty. It was casting light on a truth that had been hidden in the village's heart. Chapter 8. Tightening the Net. The Lantern Festival was in full swing as night fell over St. Mary Mead. The river Mead aglow with countless paper lanterns drifting like fireflies on the water. Their soft light cast dancing reflections, turning the misty air into a dreamlike tapestry of gold and shadow. The village green buzzed with villagers, their faces illuminated by the warm glow. But the festive atmosphere was tinged with unease. Reverend Hargreaves' death by arsenic poisoning, confirmed by Dr. Haydock, hung over the celebration like a storm cloud. And the cryptic note found in his hand, "The lantern's light reveals the truth," seemed to pulse in the air. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, stood near Lantern Bridge, her keen eyes scanning the crowd. The clues she had gathered, the glass shard, the missing lantern, the powdery residue, the waxy smudge on the cocoa tin, the paint-smudged paper, and now the discarded vial from the riverbank were weaving together, tightening the net around the truth. The festival procession moved slowly along the river, with children and adults alike placing their lanterns in the current, each one a tribute to the vicar's memory. Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, turning over the vial she'd found, its faint label hinting at arsenic. Was it the murder weapon? Or another misdirection? The vicar's diary note, "The bridge's shadow hides the sin," pointed to the riverbank. But the festival's chaos offered countless opportunities for deceit. She observed the suspects, all present under the guise of mourning. Colonel Lucius Prothero, barking orders near the refreshment stall. Dr. Haydock, handing out lanterns with forced cheer. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, elegant but distant. Mrs. Edith Bonner, bustling with trays of cider. Timothy Ellis, fidgeting with his collar. Lydia Hargreaves, sketching the scene with a distracted air. And Anne Prothero, lingering near the bridge, her eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple's first stop was the vicarage, where hands tightened on her shawl. The estate? Yes, Thomas left it to me. But it's mostly tied up in charity funds. He was always so generous. She hesitated, then added, "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Only that such matters can stir strong feelings. The vicar mentioned betrayal in his diary. Did he ever speak of it to you?" Mrs. Finch paled, her composure slipping. "Betrayal. He did say something about being disappointed by someone close. I thought it was about the church funds, perhaps Colonel Prothero." She stood abruptly, smoothing her shawl. "If you'll excuse me, I must join the festival." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Finch's reaction suggested fear, or guilt. The inheritance was a motive, but the diary's mention of LP could point elsewhere. She left the vicarage, pausing by the study door where the cocoa tin still sat. The waxy smudge on its lid, matching the splinter of glass in the windowsill, tugged at her thoughts. She needed to examine the festival lanterns more closely, suspecting the missing one held a key. Back at the riverbank, the crowd had thickened, the lanterns casting a surreal glow through the lingering mist. Miss Marple approached Mrs. Bonner, who was refilling cider mugs with her usual brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Bonner," she said, "you've outdone yourself with the refreshments. The festival is a triumph, despite everything." Mrs. Bonner's face softened, though her eyes were wary. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's what the vicar would have wanted, though I'll say that missing lantern's still a sore point. I checked the shed again. Nothing." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Most curious. Have you noticed anything odd about the other lanterns? Perhaps a wick that seemed unusual?" Mrs. Bonner frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Now that you mention it, one of the big lanterns, willow pattern like the missing one, had a wick that looked tampered with, soaked almost, like it had been dipped in something. I thought it was just oil, but—" She trailed off, her eyes widening. "You don't think—" "Not at all, Miss Marple."
"Wonder if it's connected to the vicar's note about the lantern's light."
Ellis paled, his fingers fumbling with a match.
"I don't know anything about that. I was in the vestry that night, not the study."
He excused himself, hurrying into the crowd. Miss Marple's gaze followed him, then shifted to Dr. Haydock, who was laughing too loudly at a villager's joke. His medical bag, ever present, caught her eye, and she recalled his evasive answers about arsenic. She approached, her demeanor one of polite concern. "Dr. Haydock, you're a pillar of strength tonight. I've been meaning to ask, could arsenic be mistaken for another substance, say, in a medical context?" Haydock's laugh faltered, his hand tightening on his bag. "Arsenic? It's distinct, Miss Marple. White powder, bitter taste if ingested. Why, you're not playing detective, are you?" His tone was jovial, but his eyes were watchful. "Not at all," she said, her needles clicking. "Just an old woman's curiosity." She moved on, her mind turning over his reaction. The vial's white powder could be arsenic, or a decoy, like the forged letters. As the procession reached its peak, Miss Marple slipped away to the churchyard, where the shadows were deeper. She wanted to re-examine the bridge, guided by the vicar's note about its shadow. The lantern's glow cast eerie patterns, and she knelt by the riverbank, her joints protesting, to inspect the spot where she'd found the vial. There, in the mud, was another clue, a piece of lantern wick, soaked and discolored, with a faint chemical smell. She tucked it into her bag, her mind racing. The wick could have been used to transfer poison, perhaps mixed with wax to disguise it. Returning to the festival, Miss Marple spotted Anne Prothero near the bridge, her face pale. "Miss Prothero," she said gently, "you seem troubled. Is there more you'd like to share about that night at the vicarage?" Anne's eyes filled with tears. "I told you I saw the vicar, but I didn't tell the police everything."
Revelation at dawn. The Lantern Festival had ended in St. Mary Mead, leaving the River Mead dark and still, its surface no longer aglow with the soft light of floating lanterns. The village, bathed in the pale gray of early Sunday morning, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows cast by Reverend Hargreaves' death. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and the lingering sweetness of cider from the festival's remnants. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, sat in her cottage, her mind weaving together the clues that had accumulated over the past days. The glass shard by Lantern Bridge, the missing festival lantern, the powdery residue in the shed, the waxy smudge on the cocoa tin, the paint-smudged paper, the discarded vial, and the discolored lantern wick.
The vicar's notes, the lantern's light reveals the truth, and the bridge's shadow hides the sin, had guided her to a conclusion. And now, with the dawn breaking, she was ready to unravel the mystery. Miss Marple had arranged a gathering at the vicarage under the guise of a prayer meeting to honor the vicar, inviting the key suspects: Mrs. Eleanor Finch, Timothy Ellis, Mrs. Edith Bonner, Lydia Hargreaves, Colonel Lucius Prothero, Anne Prothero, and Dr. Haydock. Inspector Slack, though initially skeptical, agreed to attend, his curiosity piqued by Miss Marple's quiet insistence. The vicarage drawing room, with its heavy oak furniture and faded Persian rug, was bathed in the soft light of morning, filtering through the mullioned windows. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the atmosphere was thick with tension, each suspect eyeing the others warily. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her frail frame belying the sharpness of her mind. Her knitting needles rested in her bag, unnecessary for the moment, as her hands clasped a small notebook where she jotted her observations. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Vicar." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each suspect. Mrs. Finch sat rigidly, her black shawl a stark contrast to her pale face. Timothy Ellis fidgeted with his collar, his eyes darting to Lydia, who clutched her sketchbook tightly. Anne Prothero stood near her father, her expression one of quiet dread. Dr. Haydock leaned against the mantel, his medical bag at his feet, his smile strained. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The police found a vial by the riverbank, likely containing arsenic, and a lantern wick, soaked with a substance that smelled chemical. The cocoa tin in the study had a waxy smudge, matching a splinter of glass in the windowsill. These suggest a method tied to the festival. A lantern wick, perhaps, used to deliver the poison." Inspector Slack frowned, his notebook open. "A wick? That's a new one, Miss Marple. But we've got the vagrant in custody and those letters pointing to Prothero. Why complicate things?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Because, Inspector, the vagrant and the letters are misdirection. The letters were forged, too conveniently placed to incriminate the colonel. The vagrant was a scapegoat, seen by the bridge but not in the vicarage. The truth lies closer to home." She turned to Mrs. Bonner. "Mrs. Bonner, you mentioned a missing lantern, a willow pattern one, hand-painted. You found another with a tampered wick, soaked in something you thought was oil. I believe that wick was laced with arsenic, dissolved in wax to disguise it. When heated, it could release the poison into the cocoa, perhaps through a ritual the vicar performed each night." Mrs. Bonner gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I never. The cocoa was my job, but I didn't touch the lanterns." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But someone did. Someone with access to the vicarage and knowledge of the vicar's habits." Her gaze shifted to Dr. Haydock, whose smile had vanished. "Dr. Haydock, you're a man of science. Arsenic is familiar to you, is it not? And your medical with the chemist in Much Benham." The waxy smudge on the cocoa tin matched the lantern wick, which you could have prepared, knowing the vicar lit a lantern each night to pray by. And the note, "The lantern's light reveals the truth," was in your handwriting, not the vicar's, a forgery to mislead us. Haydock's composure cracked, his hands trembling. "You've no proof. That note was the vicar's." Miss Marple shook her head. The police overlooked a page in his sermon notes found by Mrs. Finch. It read, "The bridge's shadow hides the sin." I found the vial there, in the shadow of Lantern Bridge, where you discarded it after tampering with the wick. A witness, Anne Prothero, saw someone by the bridge that night carrying a lantern. It was you, Doctor, ensuring your plan was complete. Anne's eyes widened, her voice trembling. I didn't know it was him. It was too foggy, but I saw the lantern. Haydoc's shoulders slumped, his face ashen. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. The vicar found out about the tonics. He threatened to report me, to ruin me. I only wanted to silence him, not this. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling like dust. Inspector Slack, stunned, signaled his constable to take Haydock into custody. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You've done it again, Miss Marple." Mrs. Finch's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched her shawl. Thomas deserved better than this. Lydia Hargreaves, silent until now, spoke softly. "I thought it might be about the inheritance. I was wrong." Timothy Ellis, his face pale, nodded. I suspected Lydia, but I see now I was mistaken." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Human nature is complex, my dears. Greed, fear, love. They drive us to strange acts. But the truth, like a lantern's light, always finds a way." As the constable led Haydock away, the room exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Miss Marple tucked her notebook into her bag, her work done. The vicar's death had been solved, not by grand hearth, and a tray of scones, clotted cream, and strawberry jam sat invitingly on the tea table. Miss Marple, her knitting needles resting in her lap, welcomed a small gathering of villagers to her cottage, a tradition she often observed after unraveling a mystery. Today, the gathering was to reflect on the vicar's death, the truth now revealed, and to restore the gentle rhythm of St. Mary Mead. The drawing room was warm and inviting, its chintz armchairs arranged in a semicircle around the tea table. Miss Marple's guests included Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the vicar's sister, her black shawl replaced by a softer gray one. Timothy Ellis, the young curate, his nervous fidgeting subdued. Mrs. Edith Bonner, the vicarage housekeeper, her apron absent for once. Lydia Hargreaves, the vicar's niece, her sketchbook set aside. And Anne Prothero, her delicate features softened by relief. Colonel Lucius Prothero had declined to attend, citing a need to clear his name after the forged letters. But Inspector Slack was present, his notebook tucked away, his expression a mix of grudging respect and bemusement. The absence of Dr. Haydock, now in custody for the vicar's murder, was keenly felt, though it brought a sense of closure to the room. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate and graceful, her pale blue eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice as soothing as the crackle of the fire. "After such a trying time, it's good to gather over tea and reflect. The vicar's death was a shock, but the truth has a way of bringing peace, even when it's painful." Mrs. Finch accepted a cup, her hands steady but her eyes still shadowed with grief. "It's hard to believe, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Thomas trusted Dr. Haydock. To think he could do such a thing." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking gently as she resumed her knitting. "Human nature is a complex thing, Mrs. Finch. Dr. Haydock's greed led him astray, but it was the vicar's discovery of his secret, in wax, creating a wick that released poison when lit. The vicar's habit of praying by lantern light each night gave him the perfect opportunity." Lydia Hargreaves, her green eyes thoughtful, spoke up. "I thought it might be about the inheritance. I suspected Timothy for a moment. I'm sorry." She glanced at Ellis, who flushed but nodded. "No harm done," Ellis said, his voice steadier than usual. "I was worried about you, Lydia, after our argument. I thought you might have been desperate enough to. But I was wrong." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at them with a kind smile. "Young people often let their hearts lead them astray. Your argument about the inheritance was a misunderstanding, wasn't it? The vicar's estate was to go to charity, not to either of you, but the fear of losing it stirred suspicion." Mrs. Bonner, sipping her tea, shook her head. "I still can't believe I didn't see it. That cocoa tin was in my kitchen, and I never thought to check the lanterns. I feel such a fool." "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "You couldn't have known, Mrs. Bonner. The wick was cleverly disguised, and the vial by the bridge was meant to be found, to throw suspicion elsewhere. Dr. Haydock was careful, but he underestimated the vicar's perceptiveness and the village's eyes." Anne Prothero, who had been quiet, spoke softly. "I saw him that night by the bridge. I thought it was Timothy, but it was Dr. Haydock, wasn't it? With that lantern. If I'd told the police sooner." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You did what you could, my dear. Fear and love can cloud our judgment, but you helped in the end. Your memory of the lantern was crucial." Inspector Slack grunted, reaching for a scone. "I suppose I owe you one, Miss Marple. That vial by the riverbank, the wick, the diary note, you tied it all together. But why the note? Why write, 'The lantern's light reveals the truth'?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Dr. Haydock wrote it, not the vicar. It was a forgery meant to mislead us into thinking the vicar suspected someone." It's the same with people. Dr. Haydock was a respected man, but his greed was his undoing, just as the vicar's trust was his. Timothy Ellis leaned forward, his face earnest. "What happens now, Miss Marple? The festival's over, and the vicarage feels so empty. How do we go on?" Miss Marple's smile was warm. "You go on as villages always do, Mr. Ellis. With kindness, with faith, with the little acts of goodness that make St. Mary Mead what it is. The vicar's legacy is in your hands now, yours and Lydia's and Anne's. The church will find a new vicar, and the lanterns will glow again next year." Lydia's eyes softened. "I'll stay, I think. Uncle Thomas wanted me to find my place here. I'll paint the lanterns next year, in his memory." Anne nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "And I'll play the organ for the festival. It's what he would have wanted." Mrs. Bonner set her teacup down with a clink. "I'll keep the vicarage in order, whoever comes next. It's my duty, and I won't let it down." Miss Marple's heart warmed at their resolve. She glanced at Inspector Slack, who was spreading jam on his second scone. "And you, Inspector? Will you stay for next year's festival?" Slack chuckled, a rare sound. "If it means no more murders, I might. You've got a knack for this, Miss Marple. Ever think of joining the force?" The room laughed, the tension easing like a knot untying. Miss Marple shook her head, her needles clicking. "I'm quite content with my knitting, Inspector. But I'll keep an eye on St. Mary Mead, just in case." As the tea tray emptied and the conversation turned to lighter matters, the harvest supper, the church choir, Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. The village green was peaceful, children playing near the duck pond, old Mr. Clegg sweeping his doorstep. The lanterns were gone, stored away until next autumn, but their light lingered in her mind, a reminder that truth, however hidden, always found a way to shine. The clock struck 11, and the guests began to take